Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the number of domestic terrorism arrests now approaching 100 this year, it's clear that domestic terrorism is a pervasive threat to our national security. Recently, Acting Secretary McAleenan expressed the need for further investments at the Department of Homeland Security to bolster the agency's efforts to prevent, prepare, and respond to domestic terrorism. This issue was underscored when I was briefed by the department's Protective Security Advisors, or PSAs, who provide valuable assistance to critical infrastructure and community organizations in the region. Unfortunately, in communities like mine that are more suburban and rural, the PSAs are significantly underutilized. This year, Region 5 PSAs have conducted 151 assessments in the Chicago urban area, yet have only conducted 13 assessments located in communities outside of the UASI designated area. As we allocate resources to the department, I want to make sure that communities like mine are receiving their fair share and are not left vulnerable to extremist threats. My team and I have been digging into this issue over the past months. Beginning in fiscal year 18, DHS began providing security grants to houses of worship and other community organizations located outside the urban areas for expenses like cameras and security personnel. However, in rural areas where budgets are tight and revenue sources are limited, we've learned that many organizations are not aware of these grants. So for the panel, as we work on legislative options to increase DHS's engagement with organizations in rural and suburban communities on domestic terrorism, I'd be interested to hear specific recommendations that you all have to ensure that communities in Northern Illinois, like Grays Lake and Aurora, are connected to DHS's resources. Do you have any thoughts? We can start with you, Mr. Jocelyn.
I have to look into a whole mess of things you said there. I haven't investigated that in any detail, but I will. I'll look into what you just said. I'd like to get a copy of what you read off because I didn't get all of it, but there's an issue there.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Levin.
Here's the thing. It's similar, but it rhymes with regard to white supremacists versus violent Salafist jihadists. And what I think—
I'm sorry, we're asking about grants and the ability for these protective service officers to go into rural areas.
Right, and my point was going to be as follows.
Okay, great.
Because it's more dissipated, you have to have the local law enforcement involved. They know who the local neo-Nazi skinheads are, much more so, and God bless FBI, I work with them, but you have to include local law enforcement, and you have to put it, just one thing, you have to make it a priority. Law enforcement response.
My question is about community grants. Law enforcement grants are being provided by DOJ and DHS, and they are well-resourced, or at least going to communities, rural, suburban, and urban, but there is a huge gap. So I'm going to go next to Mr.
Off-ramps,
Thank you.
Off-ramps for groups that help people that are leaving the movement.
Thank you.
I don't know much about that specific area, ma'am. I'm not, but the grant program was always great. It helped us tremendously in countering violent extremism. We had people in different communities, like for example, in the Somali community, doing a lot of good works to counter the propaganda of Al-Shabaab. So the grant program was always a great program, and that's something definitely worth looking into.
Okay, and Mr. Bergen, do you have any comments?
I don't.
Okay, thank you. Houses of worship have been increasingly under threat of white supremacist extremism, as seen by the horrific shootings in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue and in Charleston, South Carolina at the Emmanuel AME Church. Houses of worship are no stranger to these kinds of threats, but as extremists are emboldened to use more sophisticated tactics, we must strengthen protection from places of worship. So, Mr. Levin and Mr. Soufan, I understand that you're former law enforcement professionals. Do you have specific recommendations for houses of worship seeking to protect their facilities and congregations from domestic terrorism threats?
Yes, they have to step it up, and I think every department should have a blueprint of houses of worship in their area. They are now a target, and
yes.
we have to have all kinds of security that we don't have the time right now to talk about. But I could talk. I could send things.
Send it in writing.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I think we have some great organizations that are doing amazing work with that. SCAN, for example, doing phenomenal work in protecting houses of worship, especially Jewish synagogues and Jewish organizations. And I believe they set up a subcommittee in DHS to focus on this threat too. So that's something we need to figure out, how to engage with community leaders and how to engage with local law enforcement and federal law enforcement in order to assure that these kind of places are better protected, because
Okay.
we've seen attacks against mosques, against churches, against
Right.
synagogues, and that need to stop.
So if you have specific recommendations that you'd like to follow up with in writing, we'd welcome that. I look forward to working with the chairman and members of this committee to advance meaningful legislation, ensuring that the federal government has the resources needed to combat and prevent the spread of all forms of violent extremism and domestic terrorism. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the